colonel set down his coffee so fast it sloshed over the rim, and for a moment he just stared at the dog tags hanging outside my grandmother's collar in the photo on my phone. Not at her face, not at me, at the tags. "Where did this picture come from?" he asked, and his voice had gone strange and quiet, the way a room goes quiet when something heavy falls in the next house over. I told him it was my grandmother, that she passed 3 weeks ago. He picked the phone up himself, which you're not supposed to do, and zoomed in until the little stamped letters filled the screen, and then he looked at me like I'd walked in carrying something that had been missing for 50 years. That was the afternoon I understood that the woman my own family had let die in a county hospital, alone, with the TV on and nobody holding her hand, was not the woman any of us thought she was. My grandmother's name was Adelheid Voss, though everyone in Cedar Hollow just called her Heidi. And most of them didn't call her much of anything at all. She lived at the end of Sycamore Street in a narrow gray house with a porch that sagged on one side and a garden out back that she fussed over like it owed her money. She didn't drive after she turned 80. She clipped coupons. She wore the same brown cardigan so many winters in a row that I could have picked it out of 1,000. If you asked her about her life before Cedar Hollow, before my mother was born, she'd get a little smile on her face and say, "Oh, sweetheart, that was a whole other person." And then she'd ask if you wanted more iced tea, and that was the end of it. Every time. My mother found her exhausting. That's the kindest way I can put it. To my mother, Heidi was a chore that came due every couple of weeks, a phone call she let go to voicemail, a holiday seat nobody fought over. My father was worse, in the quiet way of men who never say a cruel thing out loud but make their feelings known by always being busy. There was no money in my grandmother, no standing, no vacation house, no inheritance anybody could see coming. And in my family, those were the only things that bought a person attention. So when she started slipping, forgetting to eat, leaving the stove on, calling me to ask what day it was, nobody moved. My mother said she was being dramatic. My father said she'd outlive all of us out of pure stubbornness. They said she was fine. She wasn't fine. I was 300 miles away at Joint Base Andrews when the call came, and it didn't come from my family. It came from a neighbor, Mrs. Byte, Okonjo, who had a key and a bad knee and a heart bigger than the rest of us put together. She told me she'd found my grandmother on the kitchen floor, that the ambulance had already come, that nobody from the family had picked up their phones. I was an Air Force loadmaster then, 10 years in, and I knew how to move fast under pressure. But I'll tell you, my hands shook the whole drive. I called my mother from the road. She sighed before I'd even finished talking. She said she'd try to get out there this weekend. It was Tuesday. By the time I reached the hospital, my grandmother was small in the bed, smaller than I'd ever seen her, the kind of small that means the body is letting go. There were tubes and a monitor beeping its slow, patient beep, and the room smelled like antiseptic and the cheap floral hand soap they put in those dispensers. She knew me, though. Her eyes found mine, and something loosened in her face. "There's my girl," she whispered. I was wondering who'd come. I told her everyone was on their way. I lied right to her face because I couldn't stand the truth of it. She just patted my hand with her papery fingers and shook her head slow. "No, they're not," she said, "and that's all right. You're here. You were always the one who sat still long enough to listen." I didn't know what she meant by that. I thought it was just an old woman being sentimental near the end. I held her hand and I talked about nothing. The garden, the weather, a movie we'd watched once, and somewhere in the early morning she stopped answering. And a few hours after that, she was gone. No deathbed speech, no revelation, just her hand going cool in mine and a nurse coming in to turn off the machine. When I called my mother to tell her, there was a pause, and then she said, "Well, at least it was quick." That was it. That was the whole eulogy. Nobody offered to help with the arrangements. Nobody asked what Heidi would have wanted, whether she'd wanted a church or a song or anything at all. So I did it myself, on a loadmaster's pay. in a town I barely knew anymore, a plain casket, a small plot under an oak at the edge of the Cedar Hollow Cemetery. 6 people came. Me, Mrs. the Cedar Hollow Cemetery. Okonjo, the man who ran the hardware store and used to fix Heidi's screen door for free, the priest, and 2 old women from the garden club who cried more than my whole family combined. My mother sent flowers, which I thought was almost worse than nothing. Flowers are what you send when you can't be bothered to show up. My father texted me a single line. Sorry, can't get away. Tell the funeral home to send a bill. I stood there in the cold while they lowered her down, and I felt something settle in me that I didn't have a word for yet. It wasn't anger. Not then. It was just a deep, gray quiet. After I went back to the house on Sycamore to start packing it up, because of course that fell to me too, the place was exactly what you'd expect. Worn furniture, a drawer of rubber bands and twist ties, war movies recorded onto old tapes, yellow church bulletins. I packed it slow, sometimes sitting on the floor of her room, just to breathe in the smell of her before it was gone. And in the bottom of her bedroom dresser, under a layer of folded slips, wrapped in a man's handkerchief gone soft and gray with age, I found the dog tags. They were old, real old. Not the kind they issue now. These were a different shape, the edges worn smooth, the chain replaced at some point with a finer one she must have bought herself. The name stamped into the metal wasn't a name I recognized. It said V, Adel Haid, and a service number, and below that a string of letters I couldn't make sense of. Not a unit I'd ever heard of. Not anything that matched the alphabet soup I knew from a decade in uniform. And there was a small mark pressed into the corner of each tag. A tiny symbol, almost like a stylized bird, almost like a key. I'd never seen anything like it. I remembered her wearing these. That was the strange part. As a little girl, I'd seen them once, slip them out from under her collar while I sat in her lap, and she tucked them gently back and said, "Those keep me honest, baby. They remind me who I used to be." And then iced tea, and the subject closed. I'd forgotten it for 20 years. Now I sat on her bedroom floor holding cold metal in my hand, and for the first time it occurred to me that I had never once questioned the story I'd been handed about my own grandmother. War bride. Came over from Germany after everything. Met a man, settled in Ohio, raised a daughter, grew old, faded out. That was the story. That was the only story. I kept the tags, not because I thought they meant anything, because they were hers, and because nobody else wanted a single thing of hers, and that made me want to keep all of it. My family sold the house in a month. My father handled it over the phone from his office. "She doesn't need it anymore," he said. Like that settled something. I went back to base. I went back to the schedule, the manifests, the long flights, the discipline of a life with edges. And I tried to put it down, but it wouldn't go down. There was nothing about her past anywhere. No photographs from before my mother. No letters. No naturalization papers I could find. No record of the ship she supposedly came over on. For a woman who'd lived 90 years, she'd left almost no paper trail at all. And I knew from the service that no paper trail is itself a kind of paper trail. It takes effort to leave nothing behind. A few weeks after the funeral, my squadron got invited to a commemoration up at the Air Museum, 2 counties over, one of those big anniversary events. We tired brass and polished planes and speeches about service and sacrifice. I almost didn't go, but I put on my service dress, and without thinking much about it, I slipped my grandmother's tags into my breast pocket, behind the flap where I could feel the small weight of them against my chest. It had become a habit by then, carrying her with me. I didn't expect anyone to ever see them. I was getting coffee from a table near the back when an older man in a retired colonel's bearings stopped beside me. We made the kind of small talk you make at these things. "Where'd you serve? How long? Isn't that aircraft a beauty?" And then a younger airman bumped my arm and my pocket flap fell open, and the tags swung out for half a second before I caught them. Half a second. That was all it took. The colonel went still in a way I felt before I saw, the way you sense a change in cabin pressure. He set his coffee down. He asked very carefully if he could see them. I almost said no, I don't know why. Something protective. But I handed them over and he turned them in the light, and his thumb found that little stamped symbol in the corner, and the color went right out of his face. "Where did you get these?" he asked, the same flat, careful voice the museum colonel would use weeks later. "They were my grandmother's," I said. "Adelheid, boss?" "She passed last month," and he looked up at me, and there was something in his eyes that I want to call fear, but was closer to reverence, and he said, "Young lady, I need you to sit down with me for a minute," away from the crowd. We found 2 chairs in a quiet corner under the wing of an old bomber. He held the tags in both hands like they might break. "Your grandmother," he said slowly. "Do you know what she did?" I told him the story I'd always been told. War bride. Germany. Ohio. He listened to all of it with a patience that started to feel like pity, and when I finished, he shook his head, just once. "There were people," he said, "who did work during the Cold War that does not appear in any history book, not because it wasn't important, because it was too important." He tapped the little symbol. "This mark, I've only seen it twice in my entire career. The men who carried it didn't talk about it. The women carried it even quieter, because nobody was looking for women." He handed the tags back to me like he was handing back something holy. "If these are real, and I believe they are, then your grandmother was not a war bride. Your grandmother was an asset, one of ours. Deep, deep cover." I want to tell you I understood right away. I didn't. I sat there under that bomber wing and tried to fit this against the woman who clipped coupons and grew tomatoes and called me to ask what day it was, and the 2 pictures would not line up. The colonel wrote down a name and a number on a museum brochure and pressed it into my hand. "There's a man who can confirm what I can only guess at," he said. "He's retired now. He'll know that mark. Tell him you have it. Tell him whose granddaughter you are." Then he stood and squared himself and did something I'll never forget. He came to attention and held a salute, to me, to a junior airman holding a dead woman's dog tags, and his hand was shaking. "I'm sorry it took this long," he said. "Somebody should have done that 50 years ago." I called my mother that night from the parking lot. I asked her if she knew anything about Grandma's tags, about her life before Ohio. She laughed, the tired little laugh I'd heard my whole life. "Honey, your grandmother liked to make herself out to be more than she was. Everybody from the old country had a story. Don't go chasing fairy tales." I told her a colonel had recognized something, had reacted like it mattered. "Of course he was nice to you," she said. "You were standing there in a uniform, looking like her. Let it go. You've got your own life." I said, "Mom, what if it's true? What if she actually—" And my mother cut me off, sharp. Then she should have said something while she was alive instead of dragging her feet about everything and making us all guess. And there it was, even dead, even possibly extraordinary. My grandmother was still an inconvenience to her own daughter. My father was worse because my father wasn't even angry. He was bored. When I tried to tell him, he sighed and rubbed his eyes and said, "She was a difficult old woman who liked attention. I'm not going to rewrite my whole opinion of her because some retiree at a fly-in got misty about a piece of metal. I said, she saved people. The colonel thinks she saved people. And my father said the thing I'll carry to my own grave. Lots of people saved people. That doesn't mean they were a good mother or a good grandmother. She had her whole life to be part of this family, and she chose not to be." I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back, because the awful thing was, he believed it. He genuinely believed she'd chosen distance out of coldness. It never once occurred to him that distance might have been the price of something. The number on the brochure belonged to a man named Wendell Brower, and when I called him and said the words the colonel told me to say, that I had the mark, that I was Adelheid Voss's granddaughter, there was a silence on the line so long I thought the call had dropped. Then a voice, gravelly, very old, said, "Heidi's gone then." Not a question. "Yes, sir," I said. 3 weeks ago." Another long quiet. "You'd better come see me, child," he said. "There are things she earned the right to have known about her, and there's nobody left to tell it but me." He lived in a small, assisted living place about a 4-hour drive away, in a room with a single window and a photo on the dresser of a group of young people standing in front of a building I didn't recognize, in clothes from another era. He was 96 and his hands trembled and his eyes were the clearest blue I have ever seen on a living person. He had me sit and he held my grandmother's tags for a long time, and when he finally spoke his voice cracked on the first word. "We were the same network," he said. "Berlin, mostly. Before the wall, during, a little after. You have to understand how it worked. We weren't soldiers. There were no medals coming, no parades, because officially we did not exist and the things we did officially did not happen. Your grandmother, God, she was good, better than any of us. A young German woman, a war widow. Nobody looked at her twice, and that was exactly the point. She moved people. Do you understand me? People who were going to be killed. Scientists, dissidents, families, children. She got them across again and again for years, and she never once got caught because she was the last person in the world anyone would suspect. A pretty widow with a ration book and a sad smile." I asked him how many. He looked at me for a long moment. "I stopped counting at 40, he said, "and I don't think I knew the half of what she did." He set the tags down on the blanket over his knees. "When the work ended, they gave people like us new lives, new papers, new towns. Nothing flashy, somewhere to disappear. Heidi chose Ohio. She wanted small. She wanted quiet. She wanted, I think, to be no one for a while, after years of being someone too dangerous to know." His eyes filled. "She wrote me the first few years. Then she stopped. I always figured she was building something normal. A family. People who'd love her for the tomatoes and not the rest of it." He looked at me then with an expression I couldn't bear. "Did they?" he asked. "Did her family love her?" I couldn't answer him. I sat in that little room with the single window, and I couldn't make my mouth form the word, because the word would have been no, and it would have broken the last living piece of a woman who had carried 40 strangers to safety and gotten exactly 6 people at her own funeral. "Mr. Typhe," Brower saw it on my face. He reached out and took my hand in both of his trembling ones. "Don't you carry that," he said. "That's not your weight. You came. You're here. You're holding her tags and you're crying real tears. And that means she did one thing right, even if she never knew it. She made you." He pressed something into my palm then, a small brittle photograph, its corners soft with age. A young woman with my grandmother's exact eyes, standing on a Berlin street in a thin coat, smiling like she had a secret. Because she did. "She'd want you to have that," he said. "She'd want somebody to know that face was hers." I drove back through the dark with that photo on the passenger seat, and I cried most of the way. The kind of crying that isn't really sadness, that's closer to grief and rage and awe all braided together. I thought about every holiday she'd sat at the edge of, every conversation that had moved past her like she was furniture, every time my mother had rolled her eyes at Grandma's stories. She didn't even tell stories. That was the cruelest part. She'd had the most extraordinary story of any of us, and she'd swallowed it whole every day for 60 years, and we'd punished her for the silence we never bothered to understand. I made one more trip before I went home. I found her grave under the oak, the dirt still settling, the temporary marker my parents hadn't gotten around to replacing. I knelt down in the cold and I told her I knew. I told her Mr. Brower said hello. I told her about the colonel's salute, the one that should have come 50 years sooner, and I told her I was sorry, on behalf of all of us, for every single day we'd looked at her and seen nothing. The wind came through the oak and moved the dead leaves around, and there was no answer. Of course there was no answer, but I felt the weight come off my chest all the same. I'd seen her. Finally, somebody had seen her. Then I drove to my parents' house and I put the photograph and the tags and a typed summary of everything Mr. Brower had told me down on their kitchen table, the same table where my mother had rolled her eyes 100 times, and I said, "Sit down. You're going to listen to who your mother was." My father started to say he didn't have time, and I said, "You'll make time. You owe her the time. You can spare an hour for the woman who raised you, since you couldn't spare a single day while she was dying. Maybe it was the uniform. Maybe it was my face." They sat. I told them all of it, the network, Berlin, the 40 people, the new life, the silence that was never coldness but cover, was discipline, was a promise she'd made and kept until the day she died. My mother's face did something I'd never seen it do. It crumpled. She picked up the little photograph and her hands started to shake and she whispered, She never said one word." And I said as gently as I had it in me to say, "She couldn't. And even if she could have, Mom, would we have listened? When did we ever once listen?" My father put his face in his hands. My mother cried in a way I'd never seen her cry, ugly and silent. And she kept turning the photo over like the back of it might explain 60 years. "I thought she didn't love us," my mother said finally. "She was always so far away. I thought she just didn't have it in her." And I thought of Mr. Brower saying she wanted to be no one for a while, after years of being someone too dangerous to know, and I understood that my grandmother had spent her whole second life trying so hard to be safe and small, for us that we'd mistaken her safety for absence, her quiet for not caring. We held a second service that spring, a real one. My mother arranged it, which surprised me. We had it at the cemetery under the oak, and this time more people came. Mrs. Corr, Okonjo and the hardware store man and the garden club, and the colonel from the museum drove 2 hours to stand at the back in his service dress and salute the headstone, and Mr. Brower came too, in a wheelchair, 96 years old. And when he wheeled up to her grave, he put a trembling hand on the cold stone and said something in German that I didn't understand and didn't need to. My father stood at the grave, and he couldn't get through what he wanted to say. He got about 4 words, and "I spend my whole life," and then he just stopped and shook, and my mother held his arm. And that broken sentence said more than any eulogy could have. I placed the dog tags at the base of the new headstone, just for a moment, just to let them rest in the right place before I put them back around my own neck where I've worn them every day since. The marker we chose doesn't say a word about Berlin. It doesn't say asset or hero or any of it. It says her name, Adelheid Voss, and the years, and underneath, the only thing that ever really mattered to her, beloved grandmother. She got to be no one for 60 years, and at the end she got to be someone, and somehow she'd arranged it so both could be true. I think she'd have liked that. My family is different now. I won't pretend it's perfect, that grief and guilt rebuilt us into something out of a card. But my mother volunteers at a veteran center 2 towns over, the kind that helps the ones nobody's looking for. And she never tells anyone why. My father keeps that brittle Berlin photograph framed on his desk. And when people ask who the beautiful young woman is, he says, "That's my mother. You wouldn't believe me if I told you." And we listen now. That's the real change. When somebody quiet is at the table, somebody who doesn't push their way into the conversation, somebody sitting at the edge with their hands folded, we lean in, we ask. We wait long enough for the answer. Because I learned too late to tell her that the people carrying the heaviest things are almost never the ones making the most noise. They're the ones in the brown cardigan at the end of the table. They're the ones who say that was a whole other person and pour you more iced tea. They're the ones we let die alone because they were too humble to demand the love they'd already earned 100 times over. So the next time you're at a table full of family, find the quiet one, the one who sits still and listens and never asks for a thing. Sit down beside them. Ask them who they used to be. You might be the only person who ever will. And you might find out, like I did, that the smallest, softest person in the room was carrying the whole world the entire time and never said a word and loved you anyway.